The morning sun painted Cedar Park in soft golden light as Mr. Thompson, a 68-year-old retired high school teacher, made his way along the familiar pathway. His well-worn brown leather shoes crunched against the gravel, a sound that had become as much a part of his morning routine as the chirping birds overhead. He carried a small paper bag in his weathered hands, filled with birdseed and bits of bread, a daily offering to his feathered friends. The park was quiet at this hour, just how he liked it. A gentle breeze rustled through the maple trees, carrying the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Mr. Thompson had been coming to this same spot every morning for the past 15 years, ever since he retired from teaching American history at the local high school. The wooden bench near the central fountain had become his second home, a place where he could watch the world wake up and reflect on life's simple pleasures. As he settled onto his usual bench, the wood creaked softly beneath him, an old friend welcoming him back. He adjusted his navy blue sweater, a birthday gift from his grandchildren, and began his morning ritual. Opening the paper bag, he scattered a handful of seeds on the ground, smiling as the first brave sparrow hopped closer. "Good morning, little one," he whispered, his deep voice warm and gentle. More birds gradually joined the first, creating a peaceful scene that had become familiar to many regular park visitors. Some joggers and early morning walkers would wave as they passed by, recognizing the kind-faced man who had become a fixture of their community. Behind him, though he didn't know it yet, Mrs. Rivera had started her morning walk. As a recently appointed district court judge, she had begun taking these walks on her doctor's advice, trying to find balance in her demanding schedule. She had noticed Mr. Thompson on her previous walks, but had never interrupted his peaceful routine. Today, she chose a path that took her near the fountain, admiring how the rising sun made the water sparkle like diamonds. Mr. Thompson reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, something he often did during these quiet moments. It showed a classroom full of smiling students from his last year of teaching. He still remembered their names, their dreams, and the potential he saw in each of them. Many had gone on to become successful professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers themselves. Some still visited him occasionally, bringing their own children to meet the teacher who had made such a difference in their lives. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of a beautiful spring day. Cherry blossoms dotted the pathways like pink snow, and the grass sparkled with morning dew. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, appreciating the simple pleasure of being alive and present in this moment. He had chosen this particular bench years ago because it offered the perfect view of both the fountain and the children's playground, which would come alive with laughter and energy later in the day. As more birds gathered around him, he remembered how his late wife used to tease him about becoming the bird whisperer of Cedar Park. The thought brought a gentle smile to his face. She had passed away 5 years ago, but these morning rituals helped him feel connected to her memory. She had always loved watching him feed the birds, saying it showed the kindness in his soul. A young couple jogged past, their matching neon running shoes bright against the park's natural colors. They smiled and waved, as many regulars did. Mr. Thompson had become such a reliable presence that people would often check their watches when they saw him, knowing that if he was on his bench, it must be around 7:30 a.m. He reached into his bag for another handful of seeds, watching as a bold blue jay joined the gathering of sparrows. The birds had learned to trust him over the years, some even eating directly from his outstretched hand. To him, these quiet moments were about more than just feeding birds. They were about connection, consistency, and finding joy in life's simple rhythms. The sunlight grew stronger, filtering through the leaves above and creating dancing shadows on the ground. Mr. Thompson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled out the morning newspaper he brought along. He liked to read the local news and do the crossword puzzle after feeding his feathered friends. It was a habit he developed over the years, a way to keep his mind sharp and stay connected with his community. Behind him, Mrs. Rivera continued her walk, unconsciously matching her pace to the peaceful atmosphere of the morning. She noticed how the elderly gentleman's presence seemed to add something special to the park, a sense of continuity and kindness that made the space feel more like a community than just a public park. Little did either of them know that this peaceful morning routine was about to be disrupted in a way that would change not only their lives, but the entire community's perspective on justice and dignity. For now, though, there was just the sound of birdsong, the splash of the fountain, and the rustle of newspaper pages turning in the morning breeze. The regulars who passed by could tell you that Mr. Thompson's bench was more than just a seat in the park. It was a symbol of dedication, routine, and the beautiful simplicity of finding joy in small things. His presence had become as much a part of Cedar Park as the old oak trees that lined its paths, and his morning ritual was a reminder that some of life's most meaningful moments happen in the quietest ways. The peaceful morning shattered like glass when heavy footsteps approached Mr. Thompson's bench. Officer Wilson's boots scraped against the gravel path with deliberate slowness, each step breaking the gentle rhythm of birdsong that had filled the air moments before. The birds scattered, leaving behind half-eaten seeds and an unsettling silence. "Let me see some ID," the officer demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. He stood with his legs spread wide, one hand resting on his belt, deliberately positioning himself to block the morning sun. His shadow fell across Mr. Thompson's newspaper, turning the crossword puzzle he'd been enjoying into darkness. Mr. Thompson looked up slowly, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. His expression remained calm, though his heart had begun to race, a natural response to sudden confrontation that he'd learned to hide over his many years. "Good morning, officer," he said quietly, his deep voice steady despite the unexpected interruption. "May I ask what seems to be the problem?" "We've had complaints about loitering," Officer Wilson replied, his tone suggesting that the simple act of sitting on a park bench had somehow become suspicious. "This is a family park." He shifted his weight, causing his equipment belt to creak, an unnecessary reminder of his authority. Mr. Thompson's hands, which had been holding his morning paper, now rested calmly in his lap. 15 years of morning visits to this same bench had taught him how to handle such moments with dignity. "I'm a resident of the neighborhood, officer," he explained, his voice maintaining its warmth despite the chill in the air. "I've been coming to this park every morning since I retired from teaching." The officer's radio crackled, breaking the tension momentarily. "The ID, sir?" Now. His hand moved to rest more prominently on his holstered weapon, a gesture that seemed unnecessarily threatening for a conversation with an elderly man feeding birds. Moving with deliberate slowness, Mr. Thompson reached for his wallet. He could feel the eyes of a few early morning joggers who had slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. The paper bag of birdseed sat forgotten by his feet, a few brave sparrows still hopping nearby despite the confrontation. "I keep my ID right here," Mr. Thompson narrated his movements calmly, a habit he developed over years of similar encounters. His wallet was worn brown leather, filled with photos of his grandchildren and a teaching award he'd received just before retirement. As he opened it, a small photo slipped out, floating to the ground like an autumn leaf. Officer Wilson's boots stepped forward, dangerously close to the fallen picture. "What's that?" he demanded, as if a family photo could be something sinister. The morning sun caught his badge, number 4471, sending a sharp glint across the park. "Just a photo of my last class before retirement," Mr. Thompson explained, fighting the urge to reach for the precious memory now lying face down on the path. "I taught American history at the high school for 32 years. The officer's expression remained unchanged. "This bench is reserved for families with children," he stated, despite the absence of any such sign. The morning had grown quiet, even the fountain's splash seemed muted, as if the park itself was holding its breath. Behind them, unseen, Mrs. Rivera had stopped her walk entirely, her morning exercise forgotten as she observed the interaction with growing concern. Her judicial experience told her this was more than a simple ID check. This was about power, about making someone feel unwelcome in a public space. Mr. Thompson carefully handed over his driver's license, his steady hand a stark contrast to the officer's tense posture. "I've been part of this community for over 4 decades, officer," he said softly. "Many of my former students bring their children here now. Some of them might be your colleagues at the police department." The morning sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the park's green expanse. A young mother pushing a stroller on the opposite path slowed down, her expression concerned as she witnessed the scene. The park had always been a place of peace, of community, not this. Officer Wilson studied the license with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if questioning its authenticity. "And you just sit here every morning?" he asked, his tone suggesting there must be something more sinister about a retired teacher enjoying a peaceful morning. "I feed the birds." Mr. Thompson gestured to the scattered seeds, his voice carrying decades of patience learned in the classroom. "It helps me remember my wife. She loved watching them with me before she passed." The personal detail hung in the morning air, a reminder of the human story behind every encounter. The officer's radio crackled again, but he ignored it. His stance had become more aggressive, as if frustrated by Mr. Thompson's continued composure. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the park," he pressed, though no such reports had been filed. People feeling uncomfortable. The irony of who was actually making people uncomfortable in the park that morning wasn't lost on the small audience that had gathered at a respectful distance. Regular parkgoers who recognized Mr. Thompson as a familiar, friendly presence exchanged worried glances. The paper bag of birdseed sat forgotten by the bench, a testament to how quickly a morning routine could be transformed into something else entirely. A few brave birds had returned, hopping cautiously around the tense scene, their normal breakfast interrupted by this display of unnecessary authority. What started as a peaceful morning had become something else entirely, a moment that would soon force the community to confront uncomfortable truths about power, respect, and the right to exist peacefully in public spaces. The confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn, though neither Mr. Thompson nor Officer Wilson could see it coming. The morning air grew heavy with tension as Officer Wilson handed back Mr. Thompson's ID with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The small photo of the graduation class still lay on the ground, forgotten in the growing confrontation. A light breeze rustled through the trees, but even nature's gentle sounds couldn't ease the mounting pressure in the air. "Listen here," Officer Wilson said, taking another step closer to the bench. His shadow now completely covered Mr. Thompson, who remained seated with remarkable composure. "We've been getting complaints about people making families uncomfortable in this area." The way he emphasized people made it clear he wasn't talking about the teenagers who sometimes played music too loudly or the cyclists who rode too fast on the walking paths. Mr. Thompson folded his newspaper carefully, his movements deliberate and calm. Years of teaching had taught him that sometimes the quietest response could be the most powerful. "Officer," he began, his voice carrying the same patient tone he used with thousands of students over his career, "I've been coming to this park every morning for 15 years. The children who used to play here now bring their own kids." A young couple walking their dog slowed their pace nearby, the woman pulling out her phone while pretending to check messages. The regular morning parkgoers knew Mr. Thompson. They'd seen him sharing stories with children about the different bird species, helping elderly neighbors find comfortable spots to rest, and keeping an eye on lost dogs until their owners came running up the path. Officer Wilson's stance grew more rigid, his hands still resting unnecessarily on his belt. "The rules have changed," he declared, though no such changes had ever been posted. "This area is now reserved for active recreation, no loitering." The word loitering hung in the air like a heavy cloud, transforming a peaceful morning routine into something it was never meant to be. "I understand, officer," Mr. Thompson replied, though his eyes held a sadness that spoke of too many similar encounters over too many years. "But I believe you'll find that public parks are for everyone. My tax dollars help maintain these benches just like yours do." His voice remained steady, carrying decades of dignity that refused to be diminished by intimidation. A group of morning joggers had paused at the water fountain, their conversation suddenly quiet as they observed the scene. One of them, a middle-aged man in a bright yellow running jacket, seemed to be typing something on his phone. The park had become unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. "That attitude right there," Officer Wilson said, his voice rising slightly, "that's exactly the problem." He moved even closer, now standing directly in front of Mr. Thompson, using his position to block the older man's view of the fountain he'd been peacefully watching minutes earlier. When people don't comply with simple instructions, situations can escalate quickly. Mr. Thompson's hands remained calmly folded in his lap, though his knuckles had whitened slightly. The paper bag of birdseed lay forgotten by his feet, a few brave sparrows still darting in to grab seeds despite the tension. He thought about all the mornings he'd spent here, watching families grow, seeing the seasons change, feeling connected to his community. This bench wasn't just a place to sit, it was where he felt closest to the memories of his late wife, where he could still be part of the world they'd shared together. "I've spent my life teaching young people about civic responsibility and constitutional rights," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his words carrying across the now silent park. "About the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." His voice held no anger, just a deep determination that came from decades of facing similar challenges with unwavering dignity. Officer Wilson's radio crackled again, but he ignored it, focusing instead on making his presence feel even more intimidating. "Your teaching days are over," he said coldly. "And if you can't follow simple instructions, we're going to have a problem." His hand moved to his handcuffs, the metal catching the morning sunlight with an ominous glint. Behind them, Mrs. Rivera had seen enough. Her morning walk forgotten, she stood silently recording the interaction on her phone, her years of legal experience telling her that what she was witnessing wasn't just wrong. It was a clear violation of civil rights happening in broad daylight. The morning had transformed from a peaceful ritual into a moment of choice, not just for Mr. Thompson, who sat with quiet dignity in the face of intimidation, but for every witness to this scene. The regular parkgoers, the joggers, the dog walkers, all found themselves wondering when silence becomes compliance and when standing by becomes standing against what's right. Mr. Thompson looked up at Officer Wilson, his eyes clear and unwavering. In them was reflected not just his own dignity, but the dignity of countless others who had faced similar situations with the same quiet strength. The birds continued their morning songs, oblivious to human conflicts, as the situation teetered on the edge of a dramatic shift that none of them could yet see coming. Mrs. Rivera's heart pounded as she stood quietly behind the large oak tree, her morning walk forgotten as she recorded the unfolding scene on her phone. As a district court judge with 20 years of experience, she had seen countless cases of injustice in her courtroom, but witnessing one happen in real time was different. Her hands were steady as she held her phone, making sure to capture every detail of the confrontation. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting shorter shadows across the park's green expanse. From her position, she could clearly see Officer Wilson's badge number glinting in the sunlight. Her legal mind automatically catalogued every detail: the time, approximately 7:45 a.m., the location, the Central Park bench near the fountain, and most importantly, the clear abuse of authority happening before her eyes. She watched as more park visitors gathered at a distance, their faces showing a mixture of concern and uncertainty. A young mother had pulled her children closer, using the moment to whisper something to them, perhaps a lesson about right and wrong, or maybe just words of comfort. Two construction workers on their way to a nearby site had stopped their truck at the park's edge, watching the scene with worried expressions. Mrs. Rivera's fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, sending a carefully worded text to the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Her message was precise, professional, the kind of communication that demanded immediate attention. District Court Judge observing active civil rights violation at Cedar Park. Officer badge #4471. Requesting immediate response. She knew the weight her position carried, and for once she was grateful for it. The elderly man on the bench, Mr. Thompson, she had learned from overhearing the earlier conversation, maintained a dignity that touched her deeply. His calm responses to the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior reminded her of her own father, who had faced similar situations with the same quiet strength. She zoomed her camera in slightly, making sure to capture both the officer's intimidating stance and Mr. Thompson's composed demeanor. A slight breeze carried fragments of their conversation to where she stood. The officer's voice grew louder, more demanding, while Mr. Thompson's responses remained steady and respectful. The contrast was striking. A clear example of how power, when misused, often revealed more about the aggressor than their target. Mrs. Rivera's judicial experience had taught her the importance of timing. She knew that intervening too early might escalate the situation, but waiting too long could be dangerous. She watched as Officer Wilson's hand moved to his handcuffs and her inner alarm bells rang. The morning had reached its tipping point. Other park regulars had begun to gather, forming a loose circle around the scene. An elderly woman who often walked her small dog in the park was making a phone call, speaking quietly but urgently into her phone. A young man in running gear had stopped completely, his water bottle forgotten in his hand, as he watched the scene unfold with growing concern. The judge's phone vibrated silently, a response from Internal Affairs. They were sending units immediately. She knew she needed to stall for just a few more minutes, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Officer Wilson's body language had become more aggressive, his stance more threatening. Mr. Thompson remained seated, but his shoulders had tensed slightly, suggesting he sensed the escalating danger. The morning birds continued their songs, creating an almost surreal backdrop to the tense scene. A squirrel darted across the path, momentarily drawing everyone's attention, providing a brief reminder of the park's usual peaceful nature. The paper bag of birdseed lay forgotten by the bench, a few brave sparrows still darting in to grab seeds despite the human drama unfolding above them. Mrs. Rivera took a deep breath. Her judicial robe might have been at home in her closet, but her authority and responsibility to justice remained. She had spent years making decisions that affected people's lives from behind a bench, but now she found herself in a position to intervene directly, to prevent an injustice before it could fully unfold. She could hear sirens in the distance. Help was coming. But would it arrive in time? The morning sun now illuminated the entire scene, as if nature itself wanted to ensure every detail was visible, documented, and undeniable. The small crowd of witnesses had grown, their presence both a comfort and a concern. Comfort in knowing there would be multiple accounts of what happened, concern that the situation might escalate with so many people watching. The judge's finger hovered over her phone screen, ready to press send on another message if needed. Years of experience had taught her that documentation was crucial, but human intervention was sometimes necessary. As Officer Wilson reached for his handcuffs again, she knew the moment for that intervention was approaching rapidly. The park had become uncommonly quiet, as if holding its collective breath. Even the fountain's splash seemed muted, waiting to see what would happen next. Mrs. Rivera squared her shoulders, preparing herself for what she knew she had to do. Sometimes, she reflected, justice needed more than a witness. It needed a voice. The morning air crackled with tension as Officer Wilson's hand closed around his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the quiet park, a sound that seemed to echo across the green space. Mr. Thompson remained seated, his dignity intact despite the growing threat, while around them, the small crowd of onlookers held their collective breath. That's when everything changed. Officer Wilson, a clear, authoritative voice cut through the morning air. The words carried the weight of years of courtroom experience, causing the officer to freeze mid-motion. Mrs. Rivera stepped out from behind the oak tree, her phone still recording, her presence transforming the dynamics of the entire scene in an instant. "I'm District Court Judge Rivera," she continued, each word precise and measured as she moved forward. "And I've been recording this entire interaction." She held up her phone, its screen clearly showing the video in progress. The morning sun caught the screen, reflecting a mirror of truth that couldn't be ignored. The change in Officer Wilson's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His hand dropped from the handcuffs as if they'd suddenly become red-hot. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale beneath his cap. His previously aggressive stance melted away, replaced by an uncertainty that made him seem smaller somehow. "Your Honor," he stammered, taking a quick step back from Mr. Thompson. "I was just conducting a routine check." His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow those words sounded in the face of recorded evidence. The badge that had seemed so powerful moments ago now felt heavy with responsibility. Mrs. Rivera moved to stand beside Mr. Thompson, her presence a shield of authority and justice. "A routine check," she repeated, her tone carrying years of experience in dissecting false statements. "I've been watching for the past 15 minutes. What I've witnessed is a clear violation of this gentleman's civil rights." The gathered crowd had grown larger now, their phones out, capturing this unexpected turn of events. A young teacher who regularly jogged through the park nodded in approval, while an elderly couple who often shared the morning piece with Mr. Thompson clasped hands in relief. "I have already contacted Internal Affairs," Mrs. Rivera continued, her voice carrying across the now silent park. "They're on their way. But before they arrive, I want to be very clear about what I've observed." She held up her phone again, the screen showing the recorded confrontation in unforgiving detail. Officer Wilson's radio crackled to life, but he seemed unable to move, frozen in place by the weight of accountability he hadn't expected to face. His earlier bravado had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh light of justice. Mr. Thompson remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but there was a new lightness in his expression. The birds had begun to return to the scattered seeds around his bench, their presence a small sign of normalcy returning to the morning. "Your Honor," Officer Wilson tried again, his voice notably softer now. "There might have been a misunderstanding." But Mrs. Rivera raised her hand, the same gesture she used to silence weak arguments in her courtroom. "What I understand," she said firmly, "is that I've witnessed harassment, intimidation, and a clear abuse of power." She turned to address the growing crowd of witnesses. "And I'm not the only one who saw it, am I?" Several people shook their heads, some holding up their own phones to show they too had documented the incident. The distant sound of sirens grew closer, signaling the approach of internal affairs. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of how quickly his morning had transformed from an exercise in intimidation to a lesson in accountability. Mrs. Rivera placed a gentle hand on Mr. Thompson's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes. "Sir," she said warmly, "I would appreciate it if you would be willing to provide a formal statement about your experience here this morning and about your previous visits to this park." Mr. Thompson nodded, his voice steady as he replied, "Of course, Your Honor. I believe it's important to speak up, not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves to enjoy this park in peace." His words carried no bitterness, only a quiet determination to see justice done. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the park. The fountain continued its eternal splash, a reminder that some things remained constant even as others changed dramatically. A few brave sparrows had returned to Mr. Thompson's feet, pecking at the scattered seeds, seemingly unaware of how their peaceful morning routine had become a moment of transformation. Officer Wilson stood awkwardly now, his authority diminished not by force but by the simple power of being held accountable. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, promising that this morning's events would have consequences that reached far beyond Cedar Park. The gathered witnesses began to murmur among themselves, sharing their observations, their relief, their hope that something important had just changed in their community. The morning had become more than just another day in the park. It had become a moment when justice stepped out from behind its formal bench and stood in the morning sun, reminding everyone that dignity and respect were rights that belonged to all. The police captain's car pulled up to the park entrance with a quiet urgency, its lights flashing silently in the morning sun. Two internal affairs officers followed close behind, their presence drawing curious glances from the growing crowd of onlookers. The morning birds continued their songs, creating an odd backdrop to the serious scene unfolding beneath the park's towering oak trees. Captain Chen stepped out of his vehicle, his face showing the concern of a leader who understood the weight of this moment. He'd known about Mr. Thompson's morning routine. His own daughter had been one of the retired teacher's students just a few years ago. The fact that this had happened on his watch added a personal sting to his professional responsibility. "Your Honor," he addressed Mrs. Rivera with respectful urgency, "we came as soon as we got your message." His eyes took in the scene. Officer Wilson standing uncomfortably to the side, Mr. Thompson still seated calmly on his bench, and the crowd of witnesses with their phones raised like silent guardians of truth. Mrs. Rivera nodded, her phone still recording. "Captain, what I've witnessed here this morning is deeply troubling." She spoke clearly, her voice carrying the authority of her position without overwhelming the situation. "We have multiple recordings of Officer Wilson's behavior, and I believe this warrants immediate action." The internal affairs officers had already begun taking statements from the witnesses. A young mother described how she'd seen Mr. Thompson feeding the birds every morning for years, how he'd helped her daughter learn their names. An elderly couple recounted his daily presence as a cornerstone of the park's community. Mr. Thompson sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, the scattered birdseed at his feet now being enjoyed by the returning sparrows. When asked for his statement, he spoke with the measured wisdom of someone who had seen both progress and setbacks in his lifetime. "I've been coming to this park every morning for 15 years, he explained to the female internal affairs officer who sat beside him on the bench, her notebook open and pen ready. "It's where I feel closest to my late wife. She loved watching the birds with me." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. This park belongs to all of us. That's what I taught my students for 32 years, that public spaces are for everyone. Officer Wilson stood to the side, his earlier bravado replaced by a growing realization of the consequences of his actions. Captain Chen had taken his badge and gun, standard procedure during an internal investigation. The morning sun that had earlier cast such threatening shadows now seemed to spotlight the officer's poor choices. Parents walking their children to school stopped to watch, using the moment as an impromptu lesson about right and wrong. A group of construction workers who'd witnessed everything from their nearby site came forward to give their statements, their yellow safety vests bright against the green park backdrop. "We see Mr. Thompson here every morning," one worker said, his hard hat in his hands as he spoke to the investigators. "He's like the park's guardian angel. Always has a kind word for everyone, keeps an eye on the kids playing after school. What happened here today? It just wasn't right." The fountain continued its eternal splash nearby, its sound mixing with the murmur of statements being taken, photos being shared, and community members supporting each other. A local coffee shop owner arrived with cups of hot coffee for everyone, a small gesture that somehow made the serious moment feel more human. Mrs. Rivera showed her recording to Captain Chen, the video evidence clear and undeniable in the morning light. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained. "This is about ensuring our public spaces remain truly public, that every member of our community feels safe and welcome here." The captain nodded, his expression grave as he watched the footage. "We'll be launching a full investigation," he assured her. "Officer Wilson will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending the results." He turned to look at Mr. Thompson, respect evident in his voice. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced today." Mr. Thompson picked up the old photo that had fallen earlier, brushing it off gently before returning it to his wallet. "What matters now," he said quietly, "is what we learn from this moment. How we move forward as a community." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen both the worst and best in people throughout his long career in education. The morning had grown warmer, the sun now high enough to cast dappled shadows through the oak leaves. The crowd began to thin, but not before several people stopped to shake Mr. Thompson's hand or share a kind word. A young boy even brought him a fresh bag of birdseed from the nearby convenience store, a simple gesture that brought tears to the elderly teacher's eyes. The internal affairs officers continued their methodical work, recording statements, taking photos of the scene, ensuring that every detail was properly documented. But beyond the official investigation, something more important was happening. A community was coming together, standing up for one of their own, proving that justice wasn't just about laws and procedures, but about people looking out for each other. 3 months after that fateful morning in Cedar Park, the changes that rippled through the community were both subtle and profound. The morning sun still painted the park in golden light, the fountain still sparkled, and Mr. Thompson still sat on his favorite bench feeding the birds. But something fundamental had shifted in the way people saw their responsibility to one another. The police department's internal investigation had been swift and thorough. Officer Wilson's body camera footage, combined with the numerous witness videos and Judge Rivera's recording, left no room for doubt. The department made their decision within weeks. The officer's employment was terminated, and the incident became a catalyst for meaningful change. On this particular morning, Mr. Thompson smiled as he watched new officers walking through the park, participating in what had become known as community connection training. The program, developed in response to the incident, required all officers to spend time getting to know the regular members of the community they served. They walked alongside seniors during their morning routines, played basketball with local kids, and learned the small but important details that made each neighborhood unique. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called out Officer Rodriguez, a recent academy graduate who had studied the incident as part of her training. She carried an extra bag of birdseed, having learned that small gestures of kindness could build powerful bridges of trust. "The goldfinches are back today," she noted, showing she'd been paying attention to his bird-watching lessons. The park had become more than just a public space. It was now a symbol of what could happen when people stood up for what was right. Local schools brought students here for civic responsibility lessons, where Mr. Thompson would sometimes share his story. He kept his message simple and focused on hope rather than anger. "You see those birds? He would tell the young students gathered around his bench, "Notice how they all share the space. Different sizes, different colors, different songs, but they all belong here. That's what community means." The children would scatter handfuls of seeds, delighting in how the birds came together, learning lessons that went far beyond feeding wildlife. Judge Rivera still took her morning walks in the park, though now she often stopped to chat with Mr. Thompson. Their unlikely friendship had become a testament to the power of being in the right place at the right time and having the courage to act. She had turned her experience into a teaching moment for new judges, emphasizing that justice sometimes needed to leave the courtroom and walk in the real world. The local police academy had completely revised its training program. The incident was now a required case study, with cadets learning not just what went wrong, but how to do things right. They studied body language, tone of voice, and the importance of treating every community member with respect. Mr. Thompson's former students who had become officers helped develop the new training materials, bringing their unique perspective as both law enforcement and students of a man who had taught them about dignity and respect. Community members had taken ownership of their role as active citizens. The morning regulars in the park kept friendly eyes on each other, not out of suspicion, but out of care. The coffee shop owner who had brought drinks during the incident now hosted monthly Coffee with Cups meetings, where officers and residents could talk openly about their concerns and hopes for the community. A small plaque had been placed on Mr. Thompson's favorite bench, not to commemorate the incident, but to honor his 32 years of teaching and 15 years of being the park's unofficial guardian. "Every person who sits here has a story," the plaque read. "Every story matters." Children would often trace the letters with their fingers, asking their parents what the words meant. The birds still came every morning, unaware that their daily routine had played a part in something larger than themselves. Mr. Thompson would smile as he watched young officers greeting elderly walkers by name, teenagers helping to keep the park clean, and people from all walks of life sharing the space with respect and kindness. One morning, a new family in the neighborhood stopped to ask Mr. Thompson about the birds. As he shared his knowledge, their young daughter noticed the plaque. "Are you the teacher it talks about?" she asked. Mr. Thompson nodded, and her father explained that they had chosen this neighborhood after hearing about how the community had stood together. The real change, Mr. Thompson told them, scattering another handful of seeds, wasn't just in new rules or training. It was in how people realized they had the power to stand up for each other. "Every morning when I sit here, I see that change in action, in simple hellos, in shared smiles, in people looking out for their neighbors." The morning sun continued its daily journey across the sky, the fountain sparkled, and the birds sang their timeless songs. But now they'd provided the backdrop to something profound. A community that had learned that justice, respect, and kindness weren't just nice ideas, but daily practices that everyone could participate in, one simple moment at a time.